Hey you guys, this is Leanne with Paper Heart Scissors, and I have been making some cards with the November Simon Says Stamp card making kit, and I promised a video on a little experiment I did about embossing resist with both the Gansai Tombow watercolors and distressing. So we'll just get right to the point here. I stamped some Tim Holtz watercolor paper on the smooth side. Very important. Do this on the smooth side because the fine text of that sentiment is very thin with Versamark. And I'm going to emboss it here with Hero Art's white embossing powder. Not clear, white. Very important. Clear, for some reason, actually accepts the Distress ink. So if you use white, you will get a great result. So here we are on the left side, which I am now adding a little water to. I'm going to have that sentiment live inside a really pretty watercolored circle. And because of the embossing, the paper was slightly warped, and what I noticed was that if I added a little water and then taped it down flat, actually that warping was reduced, and when it dried, it would dry relatively flat. It did a really great job. So we're going to start with the Kuretake Gansai watercolor, and I am going to add a little more water to my circle there over the sentiment. And I'm going to use that really, really lovely bright lemon yellow, or maybe it's a little more golden than that. The really bright lemon one is up the chain a little bit. And then add a little orange. And immediately what you can see is that the embossing is not popping out like it had with the Distress ink for me in the past. I usually do this with Distress ink, but I wanted to see what the difference was. And I loved some of these, the colors in these watercolors are very rich. And now I know why. It's because there is a lot of actual pigment in them. They're actually really creamy. So I think that you could do a really great job stamping with these, but for this technique, as you'll see, the Distress ink actually works out better because it is more sheer. So unless you want the effect that you end up getting, which is fine too. But I wanted to show you kind of what my experiment was about. So I wanted enough color, obviously, that white embossing fluid was going to knock out. But what I found was that a lot of the pigment actually stays sitting on top of the embossing powder. So I'm going to let that dry, and I'm going to then move on to the Distress side, and I've got some fossilized amber. And I'm doing the same technique though, wetting my circle first, and then applying the Distress ink with more water so that it will really kind of bleed and blend together and look very watercolor like, but it's much more sheer. So already you're kind of seeing the difference, even with just that fossilized amber on there. The embossing powder is really resisting the ink. And so then there's some orange marmalade or spiced marmalade, sorry, and then I used persimmon as well. I didn't end up using the ground espresso in this, but again, look at the difference in the resist that I'm getting. It's pushing that ink off to the side. It's pooling on the inside, where the watercolor over on the example with the Gansai on the left is actually overlaying that embossing resist, and it is not really resisting it. It is coming off of it because it's a raised surface, but it's not showing white. You'll see in a close-up example in a minute after they dry that it actually dried on top of the embossing powder. So a word of advice to you guys: before you actually try to buff your watercolors. So you can see very closely now how white that resist is with the Distress ink on the right hand side, and on the left that the watercolor is really, I love the look of how it's pooled and gathered together, but I don't like how it is covering up the sentiment and it's puddled in places. So here we are now, we're completely dry. I came back later and I am buffing that white on the Distress ink, and it is really clean and shiny. And when I buff over on the watercolor, it doesn't remove it. I actually had to use a little bit of water, and I got more of it off, but you have to be careful because it will also reactivate that watercolor. So it also took some of the color away. So that is the results that you can get with each. You might like it in certain instances. I think it could be really pretty, especially like with a lavender or a violet. But for this, I love the Distress ink. Here are 3 cards that I finished with the same concept. The only one that is Distress ink is the one that is in the middle, and you can see how much more white it is. The one on the right hand side, I actually used a gel ink pen on top to make it more white, and then the one on the left is the one that you saw me complete with this Distress ink. I hope you enjoyed this comparison, that it helps you out and gives you an idea of what you can do with the 2 mediums. More on my blog at paperheartscissors.com, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.